Just a couple of things on the front end before we kind of dive into the new series that we're in. So that last song, the last song that we sang on that worship set was actually, if you're like, where have I heard it? That was actually written by our worship team. And so if you're like, you've not heard that anywhere else but in this room, it's an exclusive. We're selling copies in the back for $5. Just kidding. Matt will have his guitar case in the back open if you want to drop a few dollars. So we're pretty committed to continuing to write songs for our community, for our city, that just are as a representation of who we believe God to be, both in our own personal lives and in the scriptures as well. And so hopefully you're enjoying that and coming alongside that. We're going to continue to be doing that as a community and helping to kind of step into that particular place. And then the second thing I want to let you know just before we dive in is, and Haley mentioned it on the front end, but we do have house churches coming up. We do have just kind of options and places for you to get connected. And so the worst possible thing would be for you to kind of come on a Sunday morning. This is like my fear as a pastor. Let me just kind of lay it out for you in a moment of vulnerability. Is for you to just kind of show up on a Sunday morning and not really get connected and not really have any kind of relational connection. Because honestly, what's going to happen is you're going to show up on a Sunday morning and maybe you come and the music's great that morning. Maybe it's not great. Maybe you come the message is great that morning, or it's not so great that morning. And just eventually you're just going to be like, you know what, I'm out. And if you don't have any kind of relational ties with one another, a type of community with one another, then you're just going to kind of enter this space, consume for a bit, and hopefully if it's good enough, we can keep you, right? Like I'm a car salesman, and do that, right? That's not Christianity. It's not the church. It's not the way of Jesus. What we see happen all throughout the New Testament is we see people gathering around the way of Jesus, transformed by the person of Jesus, by the way of Jesus, by the life of Jesus. And so let me just kind of encourage you to get connected, whether you're on that like extrovert scale and you're like, I've already signed up, right? I'm ready. Or you're on the introvert, you're like, I'd rather not talk to people or be around people or hear them breathe, right? I get that part of it, but you need it or else it's just you're not gonna be able to live in a way that's healthy. And so let me just kind of encourage you to do that and to get connected that way. Everybody good with that? Cool. Okay, so we're in a new series that we've entitled Everyday Faithfulness. And so what we're going to be looking at for the next 4 weeks is we're going to be walking through the book of Ruth. And so this will kind of take us into kind of finishing out the summer kind of rhythm in the city. And so people are kind of slowly getting back. You know, we're all coming back a little bit tanner than we were before. And so everyone's kind of coming back now. And so this will carry us kind of into the normal kind of fall. And then we'll be into a new series. But what we're going to see kind of throughout the book of Ruth, it's a pretty incredible book if you've not studied it very much. But what we're going to see is kind of individuals. There's 4 chapters, so we'll do the next 4 weeks. But what you're going to see throughout the book of Ruth is individuals continue to just kind of rise to the surface of faithfulness, honestly, of kind of looking around their kind of circumstances and their kind of cultural moment and saying, okay, I'm going to respond differently. I'm going to respond in such a way. This is what you're going to see throughout the book of Ruth, is you're going to have people all along this story and spectrum that we're going to kind of highlight and zone in on and say, like, okay, that is a life to mimic. That is a way in which, if you live that way, looks like the way of Jesus. Like if you see this faithfulness, you're going to see someone living and looking like someone who's trusting God, someone who's walking and being faithful. So I'm really excited to kind of dive in. And so if you have a Bible, Ruth chapter 1, we're going to go all through 1, kind of we'll kick around a bit in a few places. 3 things that we're essentially going to see this morning on the kind of the spectrum. So the first thing that we're going to see is really the devastating effects of having a vision that doesn't include God. Like the devastating consequences of having a life and a vision for your life that doesn't include God. Now, we can create all kinds of great visions, right? We're in Boston. We love, some of you are like, I have a vision board at home. Now that you brought it up, I would love to talk to you about it later. Great. I would love that. If you have a vision that you're organizing around and building around that doesn't include God, it will not go the way that you want it to go. Or worst of all, it goes exactly the way that you want it. And you live a full life and you never experience the love and the promises of God, right? The second thing that we'll see is the incredible enduring effects of friendship. What true relational friendship can do. And then the third thing that we'll see in chapter 1 is essentially this idea that even in the mundane everyday of life, God is working. Like he's underneath the surface at all times. So, okay, let's look at number 1, this idea of the danger and the consequence of a vision that doesn't include God. So Ruth chapter 1, we're going to do 1 through 5. It says, during the time of Judges, there was a famine in the land. Now, just a little bit of kind of Bible history. So the book of Judges is actually a whole book in the Old Testament. It's honestly one of my favorite books in the Old Testament. One of the reasons it's my favorite in the Old Testament because it makes me feel better about myself. So here's what happens in the book of Judges if you've not read it before. So basically, here's what happens. People, this is shocking to the system, people overconfidence of themselves. Right? So they're all like, I'm doing great, we're doing killer. The Israelites are like, we're so awesome, we're doing so good. God, as a result of their rebellion, the Bible tells us that they'll experience consequences as a result of their rebellion, of saying, God, we no longer need you. This is a human story. And so typically, the consequence of that would be a neighboring nation would come in and take them over. A famine in a lot of places in the Old Testament is actually a direct consequence and a punishment from God as well. That's a whole separate story. But the book of Judges, so this conquering nation would come in. The people would now look at their circumstances and go, oh, we're not so awesome, right? Now it is that classic moment of, God, I need you because life is falling apart. Right? Relationships ended, money's ran out, job's over with, everything's not lining up the way that I thought. God, I need you. And so then what we'd see in the book of Judges, God sends a redeemer or a judge, a deliverer, who would come in and then drive the people out. The people would then respond with like thankfulness, repentance, like, God, we love you. Thank you so much. This is so good, so awesome. Now we're back in communion with you. And the cycle would go over and over and over and over and over again. There was just like this crazy cycle of overconfidence, consequences, repentance, deliverance, and then over and over again, this is what we see. So this is kind of the time period in which we find Elimelech and his family are in this period of the Judges. This is just kind of the normal rhythm. And unfortunately, Elimelech doesn't have the vision to separate himself from this pattern that plays out in the book of Judges. Let's look back. Verse 1 says, during the time of Judges, there was a famine in the land. So global kind of thing that's happening in this moment in their territory. Let me make this kind of 2022. A famine, right, was a cultural shaping thing in this time. People dying. It is a legitimate tragedy, a legitimate problem that's happening in this cultural moment. And Elimelech is going to have a choice in front of him to what he's going to do now that he's faced this problem. So he says, there's a famine in the land. It says, a man left Bethlehem in Judah and his wife and 2 sons and stayed in the territory of Moab for a while. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the fields of Moab and settled there. So it says they entered into the field. So they left a field that they had in the promised land that God had given them, and now they've moved into what is essentially enemy territory. Now, who were the Moabites? So if we're kind of looking at this, the Moabites were considered enemies of God. They were a hated people. They were, you can kind of go and look. This land is about 50 miles from the neighboring land where they're at, where they find themselves. And Elimelech and his family really abandon God's land and go to this land of the enemy. They were descendants of Lot. So they were people that were considered a hated people. There's a ton of hostility that we'll see has some consequences later in the story, but there was hostility between God's people and the Moabites. We see actually in Judges chapter 3, the Moab is one of the nations that comes in and conquers the people of God, that God then has to drive out. This in Judges 3. And then we also see in Psalm chapter 60, verse 80, God actually says this about Moab. He says, Moab is my washpot. Now, if you ever want to come at someone and you want to destroy them, you just say, you are my washpot. I speak over that. I speak over you. You are my washpot. Now, what does that mean? It essentially, in Psalm 60, verse 8, it's essentially the picture of a humiliated nation washing the feet of the soldiers who's now conquered them. And so this Moabite land and Moabite people were enemies of God. And so Elimelech, hang in there. So Elimelech sees this kind of thing in front of him and is experiencing the difficulty in front of him. And he doesn't have the vision to think or the faith to think God will care and love for our family. So he takes this situation into his own hands. And he says, you know what? I'm here. I'm looking over to that land. And although I know it's disobedient, although I know that it's wrong, that land in this current moment looks more plentiful. So I'm going to go, and I'm going to take my family with me. Now, what we see begin to happen in this situation is a ton of death. I mean, the book of Ruth starts with tragedy and death. That's kind of the story. Now, it doesn't end that way, which is a beautiful thing. You'll have to come back in 4 weeks. This sermon will be super depressing, and then you'll have to hold out for 4 weeks. But that's kind of the beginning of the story. Is really tragedy and death. The problem isn't so much, if we were going to identify a problem, right? The problem isn't so much there's a famine in the land as much as it is a disobedient and disbelieving heart that finds itself in Elimelech. He just says God cannot care for us. Now, the sad reality when you get into the book is that Naomi, who's his wife, is going to experience a ton of the heartache and difficulty, and it's not necessarily in her control. Like, she's following him, she's going alongside of him, and he is lacking the vision in this moment to actually do that. He just can't see the bigger vision and can't include God inside of this vision. He has a problem in his heart. Oswald Chambers says this. He says, the majority of us begin with the bigger problems outside and forget the one inside. A man has to learn the plague of his own heart before his own problems can be solved. So he says he sees the famine. He moves his family into this territory. All right, look back at verse 4. Or no, look back at verse 3. So it says, Naomi's husband, Elimelech, his part of the story is about to end. It says he's died, and she's left with 2 sons. Okay, so husband dies, not great, but has her 2 sons. Has her 2 sons with her. Verse 4. It says her 2 sons took Moabite women as their wives. One was named Orpah, not Oprah. The second was named Ruth. Orpah and Ruth. And after they had lived in Moab for about 10 years, they've been married for 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was left without her, and the woman, Naomi, is left without her 2 children and without her husband. See that? Death and tragedy. We have famine in the land. We have, as a result of the famine in the land, disobedience by Elimelech. He's decided, okay, I can't trust God. I can't trust God to provide, take care of us. I've seen the history of our people. I know the history of God providing, but I refuse to invoke God's faithfulness as based on the history, and I'm going to go do this. See that? And now we see death. We see both sons have now died. Now, we don't necessarily know how they died. Are we saying this is a direct result of the disobedience of Elimelech? Like, would God do that? I don't know. Now, the interesting thing about this story is that when you dive in, the fascinating thing is that we actually see obedience and commitment, not from ethnic Israelites, but from a Gentile woman. We're going to see Ruth, who is not a part of God's promised people, the people that have the inheritance of the promised land. She's not an Israelite. She'd be considered a Gentile. She's actually going to be the one who displays a type of commitment and love towards Yahweh that even Elimelech didn't. This is why the book is named after her, right? That this is why this story in so many ways is about her. A couple of things here that we're going to see in this story. First thing we're going to see is essentially that, and we've already mentioned it, but we'll see the emptiness of Naomi. She's going to be left with nothing. So if we think about the capital, the kind of the great sources of capital in our society. So if we were to think about in our society, in status, economic, social power. All of these things we get like through education. So your value is based on how educated that you are. If there's any city that's true in, it's Boston, right? It's like, hey, where'd you go to school? And you're like, well, let me pull out the paper because I can't remember, where all I've been. So you're like, what school am I on at this point? I'm not sure. So it's based on like your education. It's based on how marketable your skills are. Right? So how good you are from a skill standpoint. So you're like, hey, how good are you? How talented are you? It could be based on your money. So like this is how we determine your kind of social worth in our cultural moment is based on some of these types of things. This was your cultural worth. Well, in Naomi's day, do you know what her cultural worth was based on? Her husband and her kids. This is where she gained worth, right? Now we want to kind of land ourselves in her cultural moment, right? Because we can kind of see this and we're like, girl, you don't need them, whatever, right? Like we can kind of, we can land there and be like, you're powerful, you're strong, you're beautiful, right? Like we can do that, right? But this is kind of her. Listen, we organize around things that if they were taken from us, we would be devastated. That Naomi would say that's foolish, right? For her, in her moment, to be without a husband and children, to be a widow in that moment is the worst possible thing for her. Her future is non-existent. It's not. And she's older. We know this. The book of Ruth tells us she's older, so she probably doesn't, like, her options are going to be very slim here, if any. Like, she's not going to have a family to go back to. She's not going to be able to remarry. She actually talks about that in the text, where she's like, hey, I'm too old. I can't, remarry and have kids again. And then thirdly, and we've already mentioned it, she doesn't even have kids to lean into to be with them. She's completely left in this moment in a desolate state, in a state of complete helplessness. And the text tells us that she's going to go back to Judah. Look at Ruth chapter 1, verse 6 and 7. It says, she and her daughters-in-law set out to return from the territory of Moab because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to his people's need by providing them food. Okay, so apparently people stayed, God cared for them, and now the famine is over, right? Like, thank God people stayed, continued to work the land, continued to work the crops, continued to do the difficult work of cultivating the land, so now that Naomi can go back, right? She left, but now she can go back because people were there. They stayed. Verse 7, it says, she left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her two daughters-in-law, and traveled along the road leading back to Judah. Now, the text is going to tell us, when you get into it, you're going to see that Naomi is actually going to try and convince them to not go with her. She's actually going to say to them, do not go with me. Like, don't go with me. This is not going to go well for you. Now, the thing that's interesting, because in this part, what we're about to see is the transformative nature of friendship in this moment. We're going to see ultimately why I think Ruth decides to follow Naomi. But before we get to that, one of the things that's fascinating when you read this story about Ruth is that the commentator's perspective of Naomi is kind of all over the place. Like, some people are like, she's evil. She's wrong. She doesn't want to take Orpah and Ruth back because then the people are going to be like, oh, you have Moabite daughters-in-law, so your sons did something that was wrong. They married the enemies, and now they're with you. Some commentators would say she was ashamed, like she's trying to protect herself, and that's why she didn't bring them. Some commentators would say, look, she's sending them back to little g gods, little Elohim gods, where she says, go back to your gods. Now, we know that she's not saying go back to them because they're a greater force, because she's actually going to invoke the kindness of Elohim, big G God, in this moment. That's actually the word for hesed, which means like steadfast covenant love. And so she's actually going to say, may the kindness of God be on you. But they would say, look, she's sending them back to pagan people, to foreign gods, to a plurality of gods. What is she doing? This is crazy. And so you can read that and you're like, maybe? I don't know. That doesn't really sit well with me. That's not really, if I'm kind of reading and looking at the text, it wasn't necessarily like, I don't necessarily see her in a negative light. I think that she's experiencing a type of darkness and sadness that if any of us experience, who knows how we would respond? I think in a lot of ways, actually what we're seeing is that Naomi is caring about the needs of her daughter-in-laws above her own. She's actually, like, if you look at the text, she's saying to them, hey, don't go with me, because if you go with me, your life will be worse. Now, she doesn't even have a vision for what God can do, right? And she says, don't go with me. Like, you're young enough, you can be remarried, go back to your families, let them care for you. Like, go. Like, she's like, I can't produce other kids. I mean, it's like her like argument is so played out. She's like, I don't have any other kids. You know, you can't marry them. Even if I had kids now, would you wait? Like, it's like this ridiculous kind of thing. She's like, just go back. And the scriptures tell us that Orpah goes, but Naomi, or Ruth, stays with Naomi. And so here's the thing. I think that that's part of it, right? That she knows, like, hey, you have a better chance of remarrying back, like, stay in Moab. You can remarry. It's going to be a better thing. But here's what she also knows. She also knows that for Ruth to go with her is actually going to be a danger to Ruth's life. Like, for a Moabite to go back, or not go back, for a Moabite to go into the land along with Israelites was actually going to be dangerous. So the reason that we know that is, so in the middle of the book of Ruth, you don't have to turn there, but there's a couple of places, we'll look at them later, but Ruth is basically in the fields of Boaz, which we'll look at, not this morning, we'll look at later. And Boaz looks at her, and she's gleaning in the field. She's taking, if you're familiar with the story. And this is actually what he says to her. This is how we know that it was going to be dangerous. He actually says to her, hey, stay with my girls, stay with the people working in the field. And he says to her, if you were in someone else's field, the likelihood of you being harmed is very high. And he actually even says to her, I've actually instructed my men not to harm you. So stay in my field and protect yourself. We actually see later in that chapter, Naomi, when she learns that he's in Boaz's field, actually says to her, okay, I'm glad you're going there. And she says, hey, stay with his servants, because if you were in someone else's field, you may be harmed. See, there's a very real reality that Ruth going back is actually endangering her life in a way that wouldn't be true if she stayed in Moab. There's like an everyday present type of danger, right? I mean, think about this. Think about any immigrant moving into a new land, right? So some of you, you're either a child of an immigrant or you're an immigrant yourself. So you've come to this land, and you've come to like, when people leave one place and go to another, that's an extraordinary, courageous act, is it not? Like, it just is. Like, if you should just hear the incredible stories of that being true. It's incredible. They're leaving a place of danger, a place that's typically more difficult without the chances and the opportunities, and they're coming into a better place. Now, think about Ruth. Ruth is leaving a place that's actually technically safer and going into a more dangerous land. Do you see that? She's actually leaving somewhere technically safer and now moving into a place where she is going to potentially be an object of violence. One of the things that sticks out in this story, just on the very front end, is the courageous nature of Ruth. Is her courage in this story. I mean, she says to Naomi, I am binding myself to you. I'm committing myself to you. I'm not going anywhere. Like, I'm going to say, look, she actually says in Ruth chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, look at her response when Naomi keeps saying, like, go, don't be with me, go and have a better life. Verse 16, it says, but Ruth replied, don't plead with me to abandon you or to return and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me, and do so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. Now, that's some serious in-law love. right? You're like, would I do that for my in-law? I think I'm out, right? You're like, I'm still married and I think I'm out. All right, so it's an incredible like thing that's happening in this moment between Ruth and Naomi. I mean, notice the language. So if you're looking back at the scripture again, so if you'll notice in verse 16, at the end of 16, it says, your God will be my God. That's Elohim. And that is like your big G God will be my God. So there are lots of little G gods, little Elohims all throughout the Old Testament, right? There are a plurality of little G gods. And so she's saying in this moment, no, I'm going to be with your God, your Elohim. And then look at verse 17. So here's the change. There's a change. And then she says, wherever you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. And then she says, may the Lord punish me. Now, the word there, the Hebrew for Lord there is Yahweh. So she just went from God Elohim to Yahweh Lord. Do you know what just happened? Do you know what like Ruth is telling us in this moment? She's saying, I'm converted. I'm following him as Yahweh. I'm following him as Lord. He has control of my life. I'm going with you, Naomi, with the understanding that I'm following Yahweh. I'm coveting myself and giving myself to you in our relationship because of Yahweh. Now, the interesting thing, here's what I think happens. Ruth is saying, I no longer want my God, I want Yahweh God. I want the God that you have. Here's what I think happens, and here's why I give credit to Naomi. And I could be totally off base, and when we get to heaven, if I'm corrected, that's fine. I think that Naomi's love for Ruth and Orpah is what converted Ruth. I think Ruth saw Naomi, saw the fact that Naomi would actually be better off if Ruth stayed with her. Like she's recognizing the fact that Naomi has no cultural currency in this moment. She has no sons. She has no husband. And yet what Ruth is observing is a type of love and affection for her based on the fact that Naomi's like, do not go with me. Take care of yourself. We talked about covenantal love last week. We said that covenantal love sacrifices your needs to maintain the relationship. That's covenantal love. That consumer love is I'm going to sacrifice our relationship because you're not meeting my needs. That's what we do at Shake Shack, right? The burger's not good, the relationship's over, right? My needs before the relationship. In a covenantal relationship, it is I'm sacrificing my needs so that we can be in relationship together. See that? That's the way covenantal love works. I think Ruth saw Naomi's deep affection and love for her, and it made her pivot. I think she thought, whatever is going on in your life, and this is a moment of bitterness with Naomi. This is not like you wouldn't go to Naomi to like get a pick-me-up in this moment. She is not in that place. We'll see it, but she's not. But Ruth is like, man, whatever you have going on, I want. Whatever this God is doing, whoever this God is, I want. I'm abandoning my little g gods, my little g God, and I'm following Yahweh. This is the deep power of friendship and relationship. I think this is how people find God. Like, do people find God through sermons? Yeah, I think so. I hope so. Right? Or let's shut it all down. Do people find God through programs? I think so. I think all of these things are helpful. I think they can help kind of move people over a hump. I think they can kind of help do that. But I think people find God through relationships. I think that in our kind of cultural moment, the way in which people will be attracted to the person of Jesus is when individuals and a community of people live differently. And say, I'm committing myself in relationship with you. Not based on what you can do for me, not based on your kind of cultural value or whether you check all the boxes that I need checked, you look a certain way, you dress a certain way, you have the certain clothes, you're in the position that I need to be. but I'm just in relationship with you because God's told me to love my neighbor, to love my coworker, to love those that I'm in close proximity with. I think that's how the city is transformed and changed. I think this is, listen, if we simply love people that agree with us, what type of love is that? Like that's not love. Like if you're like, hey, I will love you and for you as long as you agree with everything that I agree with, as long as your worldview is exactly the same as my worldview, I will love you. Well, first of all, in Boston, that list of people that you love is going to be very short, right? You're going to be like, no. Okay, right? So if you want friends in Boston, you better move that out of the way. You better sacrificially love people the way that Jesus loved neighbor, regardless of whether they line up with you, regardless of whether they believe all the certain kind of worldviews that you believe. Now, everybody believes the way that they believe is most true. Like everyone has a belief about God. Like even someone who's an atheist has a belief about God. They're saying, I don't believe that he exists. And that's their stance. That's where they're falling. They're organizing around that belief. They're doing everything that they do around that belief. Like everyone has a particular belief that they believe is true. And that's okay that everyone has that. But we as a people of Jesus are to people that are like, no, I'm going to be in a relationship with you. Now I want to move you closer to Christ. There's no doubt about that. I want to do that. I want to help move you towards closer to Jesus. I believe he's the greatest, most sacrificial, loving individual on the face of the earth. And when you get him, you get life. Like we believe that as a true, as a reality. Like you will flourish as a human being in relationship with Jesus. Like you think you're flourishing, you're not. You will flourish with Jesus. We want to move that, but we don't base our love on people and our commitment to people simply on that. Now, let me give you a little bit of caveat because I don't want you to use this against me later. If you are in a dating relationship with someone who doesn't know Jesus, do not use what I just said as example to say, hey, I'm going to show covenantal love to this guy who does not love God because my pastor said so. That is not what I'm saying. That's not covenantal love, right? Like I'm not saying tether yourself to someone who doesn't align with Jesus in the way that Ruth tethered herself to Naomi, right? There are lines in which we ought to operate that are lines of wisdom that'll create problems further down the line. But I am saying there is a type of relationship we should have with people that don't check the boxes, don't necessarily align with, that we can love and care for them. Not necessarily in a, I'm giving myself to you for the rest of my life type of situation. We good with that? Don't use that against me. All right, here we go. Let's move on. I gotta hurry up. Okay, so Ruth is now saying, Yahweh is my God. I'm committing myself to him, I think primarily based on the fact that she's seen this type of love that Naomi has given her. She has experienced this love by Naomi to her, and now that it has changed her. Okay, so the first thing that we see that where a vision that lacks God, there's danger, there's consequences in that. If you have a vision for your life that does not include God, it will be dangerous. The second thing that we see is the transformative, powerful nature of friendship. Like we have the ability, when we faithfully walk the way of Jesus, to bring about a type of transformation as we show them Jesus. Here's the third thing that we see. The third thing is that the book of Ruth is going to show us. It's going to show us that there's always hope, that God's always working underneath the surface. Always. Now, look what happens. One of the things that sticks out, when you read the book of Ruth, do you know what you notice pretty quickly? There's no miracles in the book of Ruth. Like God doesn't come to Naomi in a burning bush and say, hey, beg them to go, beg them to not go with you. There's no miraculous kind of splitting of water. There's no vision from God. There's like no kind of, if you're that kind of individual, and we have those people in our church who have serious problems with miracles, let's don't get into it right now. But if you're that individual, like the book of Ruth, like you can breathe. Right? Now, listen, I am all for the miraculous. Like if God's not miraculous, I'm out. Like I'm not doing this. If there's not, do I want to experience breakthrough? 100%. I do, but the book of Ruth doesn't give us that. Do you know what the book of Ruth is ultimately? I think it's for people. I think when you look at it and you read it, I think the book of Ruth is for people who look around their life and they see absolutely no dramatic answers to prayers, no dramatic events of any sort, and they see nothing but mundane times and hard times. And they're just like, God, where are you? I just don't get it. I just don't see it. Like, what are you doing? Like, I don't see it. Like, I don't see it. You read the book of Ruth, and what you see is that God is still at work. Like 1,000 times over, like for his glory, for your good, he is still working. Like there are signs of hope even in the book of Ruth, small signs of hope even in the book of Ruth. One commentator says it this, Lawson Younger says this: the longer she stays in Moab, talking about Naomi, the more she feels the deep distress of tragedies and the debilitating anxiety of the future. Yet, in the deepest distress, at just the right moment, Yahweh brings hope. Even at the faintest hint of an option, the famine in Bethlehem is over, and so there is the possibility of provision there. Now, one of the things that you'll see, because Naomi's going to miss it in the beginning. We know she misses it because based on her response, Ruth chapter 1, verse 20 through 21, she says this. She gets back to the land, and they're like, is this Naomi? Oh my gosh, we haven't seen you. And so, hey girl, this good situation. Verse 20, she says, don't call me Naomi. Naomi means pleasant. She says, call me Myra. It means bitter. She says, I was sweet, and now I'm bitter. She answered, for the Almighty, look what she says, for the Almighty has made me very bitter. Verse 21, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. So why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has opposed or humiliated me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? Was Naomi, did she come back empty? Did she come back empty? No. Who was with her? Ruth. Now, I catch this, right? Because Naomi is so swept up in the tragedy of her situation, in the difficulty of her situation, and it is real. I'm not downplaying that at all. It's unimaginable to me. Unimaginable to me. But she gets back to the land. She can't see God working, although Jesus, the Messiah, comes through the line of Ruth. I just spoiled the surprise. And Ruth is standing next to Naomi, and she says, I've come back empty. She can't even see it. She doesn't see the Lord working. She doesn't see him underneath. She can't make it out. Like she just can't see the faithfulness of Ruth, the goodness of God. She's blind to the incredible things that God's doing, even in the midst of the difficulty. The scriptures talk a lot in the New Testament about being a people who walk by faith. We actually see this in the Old Testament as well, but being a people who walk by faith. Warren Wiersbe says it this way: how do you walk by faith? By claiming the promises of God and obeying the word of God in spite of what you see, how you feel, or what may happen. We see this idea that the righteous will live by faith in Habakkuk 2:4, in Romans 1:17, in Colossians 3:11, in Hebrews 10:38, in 2 Corinthians 5:7. Over and over and over again, it says what? The righteous live by his faith. By faith. We, as a people of God, as a people living in the way of Jesus, if we're going to endure, and we've had to endure a lot over the last 2 years. Like, it has been the hardest 2 years of my entire life. Probably yours as well. And it doesn't, it's not even in my own personal life like things are getting better. It's actually been getting worse. And if we're going to be a people who endure, if we're going to be a people who walk in the way of Jesus in a healthy way, then we're going to need to be able to see through our circumstances and see a God in heaven who's working. And be a people who can say, although I may not see it in this moment, he is present with me. We're a people whose eternity is secure in Jesus. Forever. Like we have the promises of God through Jesus on our life forever. The most important thing about us is secure. Secure. And so I want to be in a community and be a part of a people that are enduring together, not because everything's working well, not because everything's going great, but just says, hey, I'm looking for God in this. I want to see him. Ruth is there somewhere. She's there. And so maybe you're here this morning, and maybe that's where you're at. Like, I'm walking through a period of darkness and sadness, anxiety. I'm just bent over with the heaviness of what I'm walking through in this moment. Maybe for you this morning, you just need to say to God, hey, God, can you show me just your areas, where you are, how you're working? Can you help me see that? Maybe there's a community of people to lean into. Maybe it's this church to lean into. Just like, God, I need to see where you're faithful. I know you're faithful based on the life of Christ, his death, his resurrection. Can you help me see that? Maybe you're here this morning and you're like, oh gosh, man, I got to change the relational way in which I work. I need to be someone who's more like a Naomi, who's just loving people well, with the idea that I'm going to move them closer to Jesus, give them a clearer picture of the gospel.